Officer Avery Hayes thought it was just another routine visit, collect the monthly cut, remind the business owner who really ran the show, and make sure no one stepped out of line. It had worked like clockwork for years. Fear kept the small town of Fellsburg quiet, obedience kept the money flowing, and every messy detail got swept away behind police doors. But this time, Hayes had made the mistake of targeting Rebecca Carter's father, and if there's one rule you never break, it's to harm a beloved parent of a highly decorated U.S. Army officer who once served in special operations. Because for the last decade, Rebecca Reeb Carter was the Army's best-kept secret, a combat legend who fought battles that never made the news. Now she's coming home, and a twisted system of corrupt cops and hidden players is about to discover that some nightmares wear dog tags. In Fellsburg, the people with badges have long confused fear with respect. Until tonight. Because fear is about to change hands. Just before we dive into this story of betrayal and redemption, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Rebecca Carter had never planned to come back to Fellsburg, Arkansas. The memories she'd left behind, poverty, heartbreak, a feeling that the entire town was rotting from the inside, were hardly a siren call. But when she got that frantic call from her aunt telling her that her father, Henry Carter, was in the hospital, something tugged at her chest. Henry's failing heart was one thing. Hearing that the local police had arrested him on some bogus assault charge was another. And if there was one thing she refused to tolerate, it was anyone laying hands on her family. She landed at the small municipal airport at dusk, stepping off a twin-prop plane with a single olive drab duffel bag. At 33, Rebecca was tall and powerfully built, her dark skin and braided hair a stark contrast to the mostly white rural population around these parts. An old Army buddy had offered to pick her up, but she declined. This mission was personal, and she preferred to show up unannounced. Her boots crunched on the gravel lot as she approached the lone rental car kiosk by the terminal. The young employee handed her the keys to a battered sedan, looking vaguely nervous, as if some primal instinct told him she wasn't just any tourist. With her quietly imposing presence, sharp gaze, and the battered Army jacket stretched across her broad shoulders, she radiated a kind of controlled menace. Not that she wanted to intimidate, but old habits die hard when you've spent nearly your whole adult life wearing the uniform in special operations. She had intended to drive straight to the hospital and see her father, but a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision made her pause. Through the chain-link fence near the airport's small maintenance hangar, she saw a black SUV. Nothing overtly suspicious, except it had tinted windows and out-of-county plates. Unusual for a sleepy place like Fellsburg, a memory flashed in her mind. Sitting in the back of a Humvee in Afghanistan, scanning the roadsides for threats, training her eyes to spot the out-of-place. Over the years, that heightened sense of vigilance had saved her life countless times. But this was home, she reminded herself. Or at least, used to be. Shaking off the unease, she climbed into the sedan and pointed it toward the hospital on the far side of town. Fellsburg had changed in some ways. A new strip mall, a couple of fast food joints. But in other ways, it looked more broken than ever. Boarded up storefronts, unpaved roads, the smell of stagnant water hanging in the air. She felt an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her father's condition. This was the place she'd fled at 18, vowing never to come back. She arrived at Sunrise General Hospital just as visiting hours were ending. A couple of deputies loitered by the entrance, their conversation low. She pulled her cap lower, not in the mood for small talk, and walked in. The smell of disinfectant hit her like a wave. The reception desk was manned by a tired-looking woman with curly hair pinned beneath a floral scrubs cap. "Can I help you?" the nurse asked politely. "I'm here to see Henry Carter. He's in room 26, the nurse supplied. "Second floor to the right." "Thanks." Rebecca made her way to the elevator, ignoring the suspicious stares of the two deputies. In the elevator's hazy mirror, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. Tall, dark skin, high cheekbones, eyes that spoke of too many nights scanning desert horizons for incoming fire. She realized she still wore the same expression she did in uniform. Intense, unyielding. The second-floor hallway was half-lit, most of the overhead fluorescents on energy-saving mode for the night. She soon found room 206. Heart pounding lightly. She knocked gently and pushed the door open. She remembered her father as strong and imposing. He'd worked construction for decades, never letting a single day off pass without some kind of chore. Now, he looked frail beneath the thin hospital blankets. An oxygen tube sat beneath his nose, and a cast wrapped his left forearm. The bruises on his face were a motley rainbow of black, purple, and blue. When he saw her, an indescribable relief replaced the pain in his eyes. "Becca," he croaked. She took 3 steps forward and wrapped him in the gentlest hug she could manage, mindful of his injuries. His once muscular arms trembled. "Dad," she whispered, swallowing the knot in her throat. "Aunt Gloria called me. What happened?" He let out a shaky breath. "Tried to stand up for myself, that's all. Told one of those cops I wasn't going to pay their protection fees anymore. Next thing I knew, they had me in cuffs, throwing me around like a rag doll." Rebecca frowned, a flicker of anger lighting up her gaze. "Protection fees? This isn't some gangster movie." "Might as well be," he muttered bitterly. "Whole department's in on it. Sheriff Davis runs the show. You either pay or, well, you end up behind bars on some trumped-up charge. Or worse." She recalled a conversation with her aunt days ago, rumors of local businesses closing, folks whispering about the sheriff's men shaking everyone down. She hadn't paid it much mind at the time. It sounded too outlandish, too brazen for a small-town police force. But seeing her father's battered form hammered home the truth, she forced a small smile. "Don't worry, Dad. We'll get you out of here soon." He squeezed her hand gently. "Doctors say my heart's not doing great. Stress, it's just too much. But that's not what's bothering me. It's the fact that they keep pressuring me to sign over the deed to our land. Like, I'd give up the house your grandparents built?" A swirl of rage ignited in her chest, tempered by discipline. She had faced down warlords in foreign lands, had taken bullets for her country. She wasn't about to let her hometown bullies treat her father like dirt. She smoothed a palm over his blanket. "First thing tomorrow, I'll go see the sheriff. We'll sort this out." "Be careful, baby girl," Henry warned, his voice trembling with worry. "They're not used to being challenged." Rebecca just nodded, her jaw set. She wasn't entirely sure how she would handle it. She wasn't law enforcement, she had no official authority here. But she had skills, and from the look of things, she was going to need every last one of them. The next morning brought a dreary drizzle. It beaded on the windshield of her rental as she drove toward the Fellsburg Police Department. She'd left her father with a promise to call in a favor from a local lawyer, someone she'd known in high school who'd gone on to pass the bar. But first, she wanted to look at the playing field. Located in a squat brick building at the edge of town, the police station had chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, more akin to a prison than a local precinct. The sign out front read, "Fellsburg Public Safety." Rebecca almost scoffed. If everything her father said was true, this place was the hub of local corruption. She entered through the main doors, stepping into a lobby that smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. A uniformed officer at the front desk looked up, eyes flicking over her army jacket. "May I help you, ma'am?" he said, a forced politeness in his tone. "I'd like to speak to Sheriff Davis," she replied smoothly. "Is he expecting you?" She didn't blink. "No." The officer stared a moment, then shrugged. "Have a seat. I'll see if he's available." Rebecca moved to the row of plastic chairs by the wall, scanning the area for cameras, exits, and possible threats. The memory of that black SUV at the airport drifted back. Was it connected to the department, or something else entirely? Minutes ticked by. She tried to recall if she'd ever seen Davis. She'd left Fellsburg around the time a different sheriff was in office. That man had been incompetent, but not overtly corrupt. She'd heard he retired, and Davis had run uncontested a few years back. Rumors had it he was ex-military, though no one seemed to know the details. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice. "You wanted to see me?" She looked up. Sheriff Russ Davis stood in the entrance to the hallway, arms crossed. He was in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered with close-cropped gray hair. His eyes were pale, and they flickered with a cautious curiosity as he sized her up. "Yes," Rebecca said, standing. "I'm here about Henry Carter, my father." He gave no sign of surprise. "He's the one who assaulted my officer, if memory serves. Is that how you're spinning it?" She fought to keep her voice level. "He's in the hospital with multiple fractures, including a broken arm. Odd how an older man with a weak heart managed to assault a cop and end up more injured than the officer." Davis smiled thinly. "Sometimes criminals hurt themselves resisting arrest. Unfortunate, but it happens." She took a slow breath, ignoring the adrenaline spike in her veins. "He's no criminal, and from what I hear, you've been forcing businesses to pay for protection. Sounds more like extortion to me." The silence in the lobby was heavy. The officer at the desk pretended not to notice the conversation, but his eyes shifted uneasily. Davis let out a mirthless chuckle. "Lady, I don't know who fed you that nonsense, but we keep this town safe. Fellsburg has its share of trouble. Gangs, dealers, we do what we must." Rebecca's jaw set. She remembered the well-rehearsed lines of corrupt officials from her deployments overseas, people who twisted the law to maintain power. "I want the charges dropped against my father." He arched an eyebrow. "And if we don't, then you'll be dealing with me." For a second, a flicker of something, anger or maybe interest, passed across Davis's face. Then he smiled again, condescending. "I see. Well, Ms. Carter, if your father's truly innocent, I'm sure his lawyers can clear all this up. Assuming he can afford a good one." He nodded at the officer behind the desk. "Show this lady out, Barnes." He turned on his heel and strode away. Rebecca felt a flare of rage in her gut, but instead of confronting him further, she forced herself to remain calm. She needed more information before charging in blindly. She had seen how well armed the department was, pistols on every hip, bulletproof vests, maybe a SWAT team on standby. This was no place for a single operator to pick a fight, at least not yet. She left without argument. Outside, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain that darkened the sky. She climbed into her car, sat for a moment, then reached into her duffel bag for her phone. She dialed a number she'd promised herself she would never use except in emergencies. "Wilson," a familiar voice answered on the second ring. Rebecca exhaled. "Major Wilson, it's Carter." "Carter," he said, genuine warmth in his tone. "Heard you mustered out last year. What's going on?" "I need your help," she admitted. "Off the record. My hometown's overrun with corruption, and my dad got caught in the crossfire. I have reason to believe the local PD is running an extortion ring, maybe worse." There was a short silence. "This is something for the FBI or state authorities, not for me. I'm still stationed." "I know," she said quietly, "but I also know you have contacts, people who can look deeper without alerting local law enforcement. I just need to verify some things. Finances, external funding, anything that points to a bigger operation." He paused. "Carter, if I do this, it'll cause waves. I can't promise." "You served with me in that last operation in Syria, remember?" she said, letting a hint of desperation creep into her voice. "You know I wouldn't ask if I wasn't out of options." A sigh. "All right, I'll see what I can do. You have an email for me to send any findings?" She gave him a secure address she'd set up under an alias, then ended the call. Outside, the wind whipped the rain sideways, spattering the windows. She closed her eyes for a second, summoning that iron focus she'd honed in dangerous places. One mission at a time, she reminded herself. Right now, the mission was to gather intel, free her father, and expose the sheriff's ring. She had no illusions about how big a fight this could be. By noon, she was downtown, wandering the main drag where half the storefronts were boarded up. In her memory, there had been a vibrant scene here. Mom-and-pop shops, a diner that served the best peach cobbler, a small grocery that always gave credit to folks in a tight spot. Now, it looked like a ghost town. The few open businesses wore a defeated look. People hurried in and out, heads down, as if afraid to linger too long in the open. She noticed an elderly woman trying to haul a crate of produce into a small store. Instinctively, she moved forward to help. "Thank you, dear," the woman said with a weary smile. as Rebecca lifted the crate. "Not many young folks around these days. You must be new." "Actually, I'm from here originally," she said softly. "Rebecca Carter." Recognition lit the woman's eyes. "You're Henry Carter's daughter." "Oh, child. I heard what happened to him. It's a crying shame. That man's an angel, always helped out whenever folks needed a hand." Rebecca nodded, feeling a swirl of gratitude and frustration. "Would you mind telling me anything you've heard around town? About the sheriff, maybe?" The woman glanced around nervously. "We're not supposed to talk about that. Word gets back and you get a visit from the boys in blue. If you know what's good for you, best keep your head down." "I can't do that," Rebecca said gently. "My dad's in trouble because of them." The woman sighed, a tremor in her voice. "All I can say is, nobody's safe. Sheriff Davis has his men collect monthly fees. They call it a public safety tax. But if you don't pay, your windows get smashed. Pay more and they'll overlook a few zoning issues or a late mortgage payment. We've all seen what happens when you cross them. You get arrested, or worse." Rebecca placed a comforting hand on the woman's arm. "Thank you. I promise, I'll do what I can." As she left, her phone buzzed, a message from Major Wilson. "Check your email. Found something." She ducked into a nearby cafe, ignoring the suspicious glance from the young barista. She ordered a small coffee, then slid into a booth in the corner. Opening her laptop, she connected to a secure hotspot and accessed her email. Wilson's message contained multiple attachments, scanned documents, a few lines of summary. She clicked on the summary first. "Carter, per your request, I pulled records for Fellsburg PD. Found that the Sheriff's Department received a massive cash injection from a group called Argent Asset Management about a year after Davis took office. Argent is registered in Delaware, then re-registered through multiple shell corporations offshore. Could indicate money laundering. Discovered that the local government's official budget for the PD shows a fraction of this amount, suggesting a lot of unaccounted for funds. Attaching detailed files. Keep me updated." Her pulse quickened as she examined the documents. Indeed, there were large payments labeled facility improvements, training programs, and special initiatives, all from Argent Asset Management. Where had that money really gone? And what was the source? She suspected a deeper network, perhaps organized crime funneling cash into small towns to set up safe corridors for trafficking, whether it be drugs, weapons, or even people. She'd seen such patterns overseas, though typically in failing states, not small American towns. Her mind jumped to Henry's assault. If the department was flush with suspicious money, why did they care about a measly protection fee from a retired construction worker? Unless Henry was symbolic. Someone who refused to pay and threatened to expose them, so they retaliated harshly to scare everyone else. She sipped her coffee, mind racing. If she was going to topple this operation, she'd need evidence beyond a few suspicious invoices. She'd need something incriminating that tied the sheriff directly to crimes. The best place for that? Probably inside the station itself, or wherever Davis kept his secret records. But getting in there unobserved might be tricky. Her phone buzzed again, this time a number she didn't recognize. She answered tentatively. "Hello?" A woman's voice came through, hushed and tense. "Rebecca Carter? My name is Linda Cook. I'm a reporter with the Fellsburg Beacon. I heard you're digging into Sheriff Davis." Rebecca's heart thudded. "How'd you get this number?" A pause, a friend. "Look, I've been investigating the department for months, but I've been threatened, followed, had my office vandalized. I can't publish without hard proof. If you're serious about taking them down, maybe we can help each other." Rebecca weighed the risk. "All right, Ms. Cook. Where and when?" "Meet me behind the old library on Perkins Street. There's a coffee cart there in the mornings, easy to blend in. How about tomorrow at 8 a.m.? Rebecca agreed. As she hung up, she realized the barista was watching her warily. She gave a polite nod, drained her cup, and stepped out into the drizzle again. That evening, she decided to check on her father once more before nightfall. The hospital was a short drive away. She found him asleep, so she quietly spoke to his attending nurse, one of the few employees who hadn't seemed intimidated by the PD. The nurse, A tall, middle-aged man named Terrence confirmed that Henry's recovery was going slowly but steadily. Rebecca lingered a moment, gently touching her father's bruised knuckles where they rested on the hospital blanket. He stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Becca," he said, voice gravelly. "Any luck?" She bent down. "I've got a lead. A local reporter wants to talk. We'll see." He gave a faint smile. "I always told you you were meant to root out injustice, baby girl." "That was the army, Dad," she murmured. "But that's you," he insisted, coughed lightly. "Army or not, it's who you are." She kissed his forehead. "Rest. I'll be back soon." As she walked out into the corridor, a chill ran down her spine. Two uniforms stood near the elevator, talking quietly. One was the same deputy she'd seen in the station lobby, Barnes. When he caught sight of her, he nudged his companion. She proceeded calmly, pressed the elevator button. They stared at her but didn't approach. Still, she could sense the tension, the hostility in their eyes. The elevator arrived with a ding, and she stepped in. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of their stony faces. If the department was on to her, she had little time to operate in the shadows. She needed to be strategic, and that meant gathering allies. The next day at 8 a.m., the drizzle had stopped, leaving the sky gray and the air muggy. The old library on Perkins Street stood next to a strip of overgrown grass. Across from it, a small vendor sold coffee out of a trailer. A few benches sat scattered around, mostly occupied by older folks reading newspapers or feeding birds. Rebecca scanned the scene carefully, first from her car, then on foot. She spotted a lone woman in a hooded jacket standing near the coffee trailer, checking her phone nervously. Her complexion was a warm brown, hair pulled back into a short ponytail. She held herself like someone expecting trouble. Rebecca took a breath and approached. "Linda Cook?" The woman glanced up sharply, then relaxed. "Rebecca Carter." They each ordered coffee, then moved to a bench where no one else sat. A black cat wandered by, ignoring them entirely. Linda's voice was low. "First, let me say I'm sorry about your father. I tried to reach out earlier, but the lines in this town are compromised, both figuratively and literally." Rebecca studied her. "You said you've been investigating the department?" Linda nodded. "Yes, for months. I've compiled anecdotal evidence, testimony from small business owners about the extortion, from families whose loved ones got arrested on nonsense charges. But it's not enough to go to press. I need something tangible, ideally internal documents, or a whistleblower inside the force." Rebecca's mind flashed to the files from Wilson, but those mostly showed suspicious finances, not the day-to-day criminal acts. "If I got you real documentation, say bank statements, wire transfers, would that be enough?" "Yes. And if we had recordings or photographic proof of them making threats, that'd be even better." She took a breath, eyes darting about. "But be careful. I know at least one other reporter who vanished after asking too many questions. Officially, he moved to Chicago, but all his belongings were still in his apartment." Rebecca's stomach twisted. "They're disappearing people?" Linda's eyes flickered with anger and fear. "I can't prove it, but it sure looks that way. Even a small story I tried to run about nepotism in the force was pulled after Davis allegedly threatened our editor." Rebecca gritted her teeth. "They have the entire town in a stranglehold." Linda leaned forward. "Listen, I have a contact inside City Hall who's been feeding me small bits. He says Davis is part of a bigger operation, something about black market trafficking routes that run through Fellsburg. That would explain the mysterious funding. If we can nail him on that, maybe federal agencies will step in." It matched the conclusion Rebecca was inching toward. Some kind of criminal network funneling money into Fellsburg to use it as a pipeline. "What's your next move?" Linda shrugged helplessly. "I'm at a dead end. I can't break into the PD or intercept their communications. But you? I heard rumors about your military background. If you could get inside, copy their server files, maybe that'd be our smoking gun." Her gaze was pleading, and for a second, Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility. She didn't want to put Linda in more danger, but she also knew that the reporter's publication might be the key to shining a bright enough spotlight to protect them both. "I'll see what I can do," Rebecca finally said. "But if you get any leads, anything else that helps, you call me immediately." They exchanged numbers. As Linda rose to leave, she stumbled, nearly spilling her coffee. Rebecca grabbed her elbow to steady her, and that was when Rebecca saw it. A figure in a parked SUV, a camera lens poking out, aimed right at them. She let go, trying not to react, but Linda noticed her tension. "What is it?" "Don't look now, but across the street, black SUV. They're watching." Linda paled. "We should go separately. Be careful." Rebecca walked away, forcing herself not to break into a run. She circled around the block, slipping through a narrow alley, emerging behind a used bookstore. There, she found her sedan and drove off, scanning the mirrors constantly. The black SUV was nowhere in sight, but that didn't soothe her nerves. By the time she reached the modest motel where she'd been staying, her adrenaline was still pumping. She locked the door, put a chair under the handle for extra measure, then checked her phone. A text from Major Wilson read, "Call me, urgent." She dialed. "Carter here. I have more info," Wilson said without preamble. "That shell company, Argent Asset Management? It's part of a larger network with suspected ties to arms smuggling, narcotics, and human trafficking. It's like an octopus with tentacles in multiple small towns across America. They buy influence in local PDs or city councils, then set up pipelines. Fellsburg might be a node for something bigger." Rebecca exhaled sharply. "They're definitely extorting locals, possibly disappearing people. So we're dealing with a serious criminal conspiracy." "Precisely. Carter, I also found a reference to a special facility near Fellsburg, some old manufacturing plant that got refurbished with private funds. Could be a storage site for contraband, or worse." She remembered the old textile mill by the river. It had been closed for years. If it had new owners, that must be it. Wilson's tone was grave. "If you dig too deep, you'll be stepping on major toes. This is the kind of thing that usually calls for a joint federal task force. But that takes time, and they're quick to vanish. I sense you're not going to stand down." "You know me too well," Rebecca said quietly. "These people hurt my father, and they're terrorizing my hometown. I can't just walk away." He sighed. "Then be smart. If you can gather concrete evidence, I can get it to the right agencies under the radar. But watch your back, Carter. These folks play for keeps." She ended the call and leaned back against the faded motel wallpaper, mind spinning with possibilities. Breaking into the police station's server or the old mill to gather evidence was high risk. She'd need help, someone who could handle tech, maybe a lookout. She thought of Linda Cook, but that was too dangerous for a civilian with no operational training. She scrolled through her phone contacts. Most were old army buddies scattered around the country. Then she paused at a name, Malik Jamison. They'd served together in a special ops unit for 2 years, before he retired to become a private security consultant. He was the kind of guy who could bypass an alarm system while whistling a tune. It took a few rings before he picked up, his deep baritone a welcome sound. "Becca Carter, as I live and breathe. It's been a while." She cut to the chase, explaining the situation briefly. He was silent for a few moments. "You telling me you want me to come down to some podunk town in Arkansas to help break into a police station? Girl, that is risky business. Trust me, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death. My father's already hospitalized. The corruption's off the charts." Malik let out a low whistle. "All right, I owe you one for that time in Yemen anyway. I can be there by tomorrow night. But I'm not promising any miracles." "That's all I ask," she said, relief washing over her. True to his word, Malik arrived late the following evening, pulling up in a dusty pickup he'd rented at the airport. Rebecca met him at a deserted truck stop on the outskirts of Fellsburg to avoid drawing attention. She recognized him instantly. Tall, muscular, dark skin, with that easy grin that belied a lethal skill set. They bumped fists. "Been too long," he said, giving her a quick once-over. "You look good, Carter." "Thanks. Wish the circumstances were better." They grabbed a corner booth in the truck stop diner, ordering coffee and a slice of pie each. She laid out everything: the Argent money, the sheriff's extortion, her father's assault, and the rumored trafficking link. Malik listened, occasionally jotting notes on a small pad. Finally, he said, "The easiest infiltration target might be the old mill, especially if it's used as a stash house or a detention site. The police station, though, that's trickier. They have cameras, electronic locks, guards. We can't exactly waltz in." She nodded grimly. "Agreed. The station's server might have files, but it's too risky. The mill could hold physical evidence of illegal cargo. That might be enough. What about your reporter friend? She can blow this wide open once we get proof." "Exactly. But I also have a contact who can pass info to federal agencies, quietly. If we gather enough evidence, they'll swoop in." They hashed out a plan. Step 1. Surveil the mill. Identify guard rotations, camera placements, any sign of shipments. Step 2. If possible, sneak in. Document what they find. Photos, videos, or physical contraband. Step 3. Get that evidence to Linda Cook and to Major Wilson. Then blow the corruption wide open, ensuring the sheriff can't silence them all. It sounded straightforward enough, but infiltration was always a gamble. One misstep could lead to a firefight they might not survive. Rebecca felt a jolt of adrenaline at the prospect. Part of her had missed the direct action of her army days. Another part worried this was bigger than either of them realized. They finished their pie, left the diner, and parted ways to avoid drawing suspicion. Tomorrow night, they'd make their move. In the hours leading up to the operation, Rebecca steeled herself. She visited her father briefly, found him dozing. The nurse informed her that Henry was stable but still weak. That gave her some small comfort. At least his condition wasn't worsening. She prayed the stress of all this wouldn't break him further. Next, she touched base with Linda Cook, who sounded anxious and excited. "Once you have proof," Linda said, "I'll gather every bit of documentation I've got. We'll publish online, have it ready to go out to multiple news outlets simultaneously. They can't silence us all." Rebecca admired Linda's courage. "Just be careful. If anyone suspects you know about the break-in." "I understand," Linda said quietly. "We're both putting our lives on the line, Ms. Carter." When darkness fell, she rendezvoused with Malik near a stretch of forest that backed up against the old mill. The building sat on a patch of land near the river, ringed by a rusty chain-link fence. From their vantage point behind some thick pines, they had a partial view of the main entrance. A gate with a guard booth, a single overhead floodlight. Through binoculars, Rebecca counted at least 4 men patrolling outside. They carried sidearms, likely more firepower inside. A black SUV was parked near the entrance, and another near the loading dock on the east side. Malik set up a small drone, carefully launching it into the night sky with no lights. Through the drone's infrared camera feed on his tablet, they saw a handful of heat signatures inside the structure. About 8 men total, plus something that looked like multiple crates stacked near the loading dock. "Could be weapons or drugs," Malik muttered. "Or people." She felt her blood run cold at that possibility. "We won't know until we get inside." The plan was to infiltrate from the rear, where a section of fence had partially collapsed. Slip in quietly, avoid or neutralize any roving guards, and gather photographic or video evidence of illicit cargo. Then exfil without being detected. If it all went smoothly, they'd be in and out in under 20 minutes. Malik powered down the drone. They donned dark clothing, Kevlar vests beneath their jackets, and black caps to blend into the shadows. Rebecca checked her sidearm, a small 9mm. She hoped not to fire a single shot, but better safe than sorry. Malik had a suppressed pistol and a multi-tool for bypassing locks. They also wore earpiece radios for silent communication. Under the moonless sky, they approached the fence's collapsed section. Carefully, they slid through. The ground was muddy, and the odor of rotting vegetation mingled with the tang of the river. They moved slowly, listening for any sign of a patrol. The first obstacle was a guard ambling around the perimeter with a flashlight. Rebecca and Malik pressed themselves flat against the wall of a storage shed until he passed. The guard seemed bored, occasionally kicking at stones. Once he was out of sight, they crept onward. Near the building's rear entrance, a single camera was mounted high on the wall. Malik hooked up a small hacking device to the camera's external port. Within seconds, the feed looped. A standard trick. They slipped inside through a door that looked rarely used, its lock rusty. Malik jimmied it open in under a minute. Inside was a corridor lined with old electrical panels. The smell of mold was strong. Distant voices echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. They advanced, footsteps silent on the concrete floor. At a fork, they paused to get their bearings. The drone recon had shown a large open area near the center, likely the old manufacturing floor. That's where the crates were. They moved left, down a hallway that ended in a partially open set of double doors. Peeking through the gap, Rebecca saw a vast open space lit by a few high bay lights. Indeed, crates were stacked in rows, and two men stood by a forklift. Another pair were near the far wall, talking quietly. Malik raised his phone, snapping a few silent photos. Then he gestured for them to move along the perimeter, searching for any identifying markings on the crate. They carefully crept forward, shielded by the large metal pillars supporting the old mill roof. As they got closer, Rebecca's eyes caught the stenciling on several crates. Medical supplies. But something about them seemed off. Too heavy-duty, as if they were built to hold something heavier or more dangerous than bandages and syringes. She pointed to a forklift that had a crate labeled "Fragile Laboratory Equipment." With painstaking care, they managed to pry open a corner of the crate. Inside were assault rifles, brand new, still wrapped in oiled plastic. Rebecca's pulse pounded. She motioned for Malik to snap pictures. Then she noticed smaller crates labeled "Personal Effects," and she realized, with a chill, that these could be tied to human trafficking. She wanted to open them, see if they contained passports, clothing, or something more sinister, but they couldn't risk too much noise. The men near the forklift suddenly moved, heading in their direction. She and Malik ducked behind a steel support beam, heart hammering. She forced her breath steady, her mind flicking back to training. Remain calm, remain undetected. The men paused just a few feet away, lighting cigarettes and chatting about some shipment due to arrive tomorrow. At that moment, a door banged open on the opposite side, and two more men came in, dragging a terrified-looking woman with a gag over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, mascara running with tears. Rebecca felt white-hot fury surge inside her. She wanted to intervene, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. She watched as they shoved the woman toward the forklift area. One of the men barked, "Keep her in the side room until the buyer arrives. No marks, though. She needs to look presentable." Human trafficking confirmed, Rebecca thought, her stomach twisting. The woman was probably a kidnapped local or someone smuggled in from elsewhere. She forced herself to remain hidden. If they went loud now, it would be a bloodbath with hostages at risk. Malik caught her eye, a silent question. "Do we do something now?" She shook her head slightly, then pointed to her phone, indicating they must collect further evidence. Slowly, they retreated back along the wall, capturing video of the woman being led away at gunpoint. The men didn't notice them, caught up in their vile business. They reached the corridor again, hearts pounding. Once they were in relative safety, Rebecca whispered, "We have to help her. But not now. These guys have the place locked down." Malik nodded, face grim. "We can call in your Fed contact, coordinate a rescue." They were almost to the rear door when a figure stepped out of the shadows, gun raised. One of the patrolling guards, a wiry man with a baseball cap. "Freeze," he hissed. Rebecca reacted instantly, swatting at his weapon while Malik lunged forward. Together they disarmed him, but the guard managed a strangled shout. A bullet discharged into the ceiling, the noise echoing in the old corridors. "Move!" Rebecca hissed at Malik. They left the guard unconscious, but the alarm had been sounded. Shouts erupted from the main area. They sprinted down the hallway, hearts thundering. Another guard appeared at the far end, raising a submachine gun. Malik fired a suppressed shot that caught the man in the shoulder, sending him spinning. They vaulted over him, bursting out the rear door into the night air. The perimeter floodlights blazed on, and they heard the roar of engines. Guards were mobilizing. They dashed to the fence, returning through the same collapsed section. Shots whizzed by them, striking the muddy ground, but they were already in the trees, vanishing into darkness. When they finally reached the safety of their parked vehicles off a nearby dirt road, they took a moment to breathe, adrenaline coursing. "We got enough," Malik panted, holding up his phone. "Guns, that woman." That's the evidence you need. Rebecca's chest felt tight. We need to get an extraction for that woman and any others they might have, but at least we can blow the lid off this operation. Malik grimaced. They'll lock it down now, probably move the hostages, or kill them. She swallowed hard. We have to move fast. Get your footage to Linda Cook. I'll call my contact. Within an hour, they were holed up in a seedy motel room with Linda Cook, who watched the footage with wide, horrified eyes. It's worse than I imagined. Malik dumped the rest of the images and video files onto Linda's laptop. She immediately began organizing them into a digital folder, cross-referencing data from her previous notes. We've got 'em, with illegal weapons, multiple hostages. This is explosive. Rebecca dialed Major Wilson. When he answered, she spoke rapidly, explaining the infiltration, the evidence of weapons smuggling, and the presence of trafficked individuals. She could hear him cursing under his breath. All right, he said. I'll contact a friend in the FBI. They'll coordinate with some folks who can do a raid, but given the infiltration went hot, the suspects may relocate quickly. We need boots on the ground ASAP. Agreed, Rebecca said. We'll do what we can to stall them, or at least keep track of their movements. She ended the call to find Linda staring at her with a mix of admiration and fear. This story, it's going to rock the entire county. The sheriff's in bed with major criminal elements. Malik nodded. They'll come after you hard if you publish. You better have a safe place to lay low. Linda set her jaw. I've got a friend outside the county with a secure cabin. Once I hit publish, I'll vanish. Rebecca set a hand on Linda's shoulder. You're brave. We owe you. Linda forced a shaky smile. If this frees your father and every other person they've terrorized, it's worth it. They parted ways, Linda leaving to finalize her articles. Malik returned to his rented pickup to keep watch, while Rebecca paced the motel room, mind buzzing with how to rescue the hostages. She was no stranger to direct action, but going in guns blazing might get them killed, or worse, the hostages. At midnight, her phone buzzed again. Linda's voice came through, urgent. Rebecca, I just heard from my city hall contact. They're planning to move the hostages at sunrise. Ship them out of the mill to an unknown location. The sheriff wants to sanitize the area. A cold dread washed over her. We have maybe 5 or 6 hours to stop them. She and Malik convened in her motel room, laying out their gear on the bed. For a moment it felt surreal, like they were prepping for a mission overseas, only this time the battlefield was a rundown Arkansas mill. This is bigger than just you and me, Malik said, checking his sidearm. If we wait for the feds, those hostages could vanish. Rebecca inhaled. Then we do it ourselves. Hit them before they can move out. We know the layout, we have the advantage of surprise. They'll assume we're long gone. He studied her face. You realize the PD might back them up. We could be fighting half the sheriff's department. She pulled on a tactical vest, jaws set. If that's what it takes to save innocent lives, there was a flicker of a grin on Malik's lips. All right, let's do it. They hashed out a plan, approach from the same wooded side, but this time they'd go in loaded for a direct assault. They needed more than just the two of them, though, so they made a few calls to people they trusted. Locals Rebecca knew from childhood who hated the sheriff, plus a couple of Malik's private security buddies who happened to be within driving distance. It wouldn't be a large force, but hopefully enough to distract, rescue hostages, and keep the criminals pinned down until the feds arrived. By 4 a.m., a ragtag group of 6 had gathered near the edge of the woods. Malik's associates were ex-military, wearing nondescript dark clothing and carrying personal firearms. 2 locals, a tough-looking mechanic named Jody and a retired Marine named Thomas, brought shotguns and battered Kevlar vests. They all huddled around a small lantern as Rebecca briefed them on the infiltration route, the probable number of hostiles, the hostages' location, if it hadn't changed. She looked each of them in the eye. Listen, these people are dangerous. They have heavy firepower and no qualms about shooting. We're going in primarily to rescue captives. Don't try to be a hero. Stick to the plan. The group nodded, faces grim. Jody wiped sweat from her brow, despite the cool night. Thomas just stared at the mill with an intensity that told Rebecca he was prepared for battle. They moved in darkness, splitting into 2 teams. Rebecca, Malik, and Thomas would infiltrate from the rear, the same corridor they used before. Jody and the two ex-military buddies would create a diversion at the gate, drawing as many guards as possible away from the interior. At exactly 4:30 a.m., Jody revved a truck loudly at the front entrance, headlights blasting the guard booth. Her companions fired a few shots in the air. The response was immediate. Alarms sounded, guards scrambled to the front. That was Rebecca's cue. She and her small team slipped through the fence at the collapsed section. The floodlights flickered on again, but many of the men had rushed to the front. They crept into the corridor. This time they found no one inside. The sound of gunfire and shouting echoed from the main gate. They pressed on, passing the forklift area. They glimpsed a couple of guards running toward the front, presumably to repel the assault. With the men distracted, the space was almost deserted. Rebecca prayed the hostages were still here. They found the side room where they'd seen the woman taken the night before. A locked metal door barred the way. Thomas fired a short blast with his shotgun, blowing the lock. Inside, they found a half-dozen terrified captives. Women and a few men, tied and gagged. One of them looked battered, her eyes swollen from crying. Who are you?" one captive rasped once the gag was removed. "Friends," Rebecca said gently. "We're getting you out of here." Thomas and Malik helped untie them. One woman was too weak to walk on her own, so Rebecca hoisted her carefully. The group filed out, hearts pounding. But they couldn't leave yet. Another set of moans came from deeper in the corridor. They discovered a second room with more captives, all in rough shape. By the time they freed everyone, they had nearly 15 survivors, some of whom seemed to have been starved or beaten. Then a shout. "They're in here!" Rebecca turned to see 3 armed men at the end of the corridor. Shots rang out. She shoved the hostages back into cover while Malik and Thomas returned fire. 2 of the men went down, but the third ducked behind a corner, spraying bullets wildly. Sparks flew as rounds ricocheted off metal piping. "We need to move," Malik barked, reloading. Rebecca nodded. "Thomas, you and I will suppress. Malik, get them out the back." Thomas unleashed a barrage of shotgun blasts down the hallway, forcing the remaining guard into cover. Rebecca slid low across the corridor, popping off a few pistol shots. She felt the old rhythm of combat surge in her veins. This was the battlefield, chaos and adrenaline swirling in a lethal dance. The surviving guard managed to toss a flashbang. The device clattered across the floor, going off with a deafening pop and blinding flash. Rebecca's vision blurred, ears ringing. She stumbled. By the time she regained her bearings, she heard footsteps retreating. "You okay?" Thomas shouted, blinking tears from his eyes. "Fine," Rebecca managed, though her head pounded. "We gotta get out." They joined Malik and the freed captives at the rear exit. The group poured into the night, heading for the forest. The plan was to rendezvous at a safe house, an abandoned farmhouse half a mile away. The diversion at the front entrance had died down, indicating Jody's team had likely pulled back. Now the criminals would be regrouping. They reached the tree line. Just then, an SUV's headlights cut through the darkness, screeching to a halt near them. Doors flew open and Rebecca braced for a firefight. But to her shock, Linda Cook stepped out, flanked by a tall woman in a federal marshal's vest. "Carter!" Linda yelled, running closer. "We got a break. Someone in the FBI overcame the bureaucratic hurdles. They're here to help." The tall marshal strode forward, weapon drawn. "Everybody stand down, we're federal agents." More vehicles arrived behind them, men and women in tactical gear bearing federal badges. The cavalry, at last. Rebecca let out a shuddering breath, relief and exhaustion rolling through her. "We've got about 15 hostages, all needing medical attention." The marshal's face hardened at the sight of the injured captives. "We've got ambulances on the way. Good job, folks." Soon paramedics and Fed agents swarmed the area, securing the mill, collecting the crates of weapons. A battered van near the loading dock held more terrified souls, some so traumatized they couldn't speak. The scale of the operation was horrifying. In the aftermath, the sun rose over Fellsburg to the sound of helicopter blades chopping the sky. The feds had arrived in force, sealing off roads, arresting the criminals who were still present. Among those led away in cuffs was one of Sheriff Davis's top lieutenants, cursing and spitting. Rebecca was reunited with Jody and the others who had manned the diversion. One of Malik's ex-military buddies had caught a bullet in the leg but was stable. Everyone else had escaped serious injury. A few hours later, at the edge of the crime scene, Linda Cook cornered Rebecca. "I can't believe it," she breathed. "We did it. We actually did it." Rebecca gave a weary smile. "The feds are rounding up the criminals, but the sheriff's not here." She noticed Davis was nowhere in sight. Malik walked over, phone in hand. "Just got word. Davis is holed up in the PD, refusing to come out. Local cops loyal to him are barricading the place." "Of course they are," Rebecca muttered. "He's not going to go down quietly." Linda's face paled. "You can't be thinking of going there." "I have to," Rebecca said quietly. "He's the one behind my father's arrest, and he's the centerpiece of this corruption." Malik's gaze flicked between them. "If the feds storm the station, there might be a firefight." Rebecca nodded. "Better I go first. Maybe I can talk sense, or at least minimize casualties. Federal backup can follow." Linda looked anguished. "Just be careful." When Rebecca arrived at the police station with a pair of FBI vehicles trailing her, a handful of uniformed officers stood outside, rifles drawn. She stepped out of her car, hands up in a non-threatening gesture. The FBI agents behind her took cover behind their SUV doors. The deputy in front, a broad-shouldered man named Harlan, aimed his rifle. "Stay back." Rebecca recognized him as one of Davis's close men. "Deputy Harlan, it's over. The mill's compromised. The feds have everything. Surrender now and maybe you'll get a plea deal." He hesitated, sweat beading on his brow. Then the station doors swung open, and Sheriff Davis emerged, pistol in hand. His expression was a twisted mix of defiance and desperation. "You?" he spat. "You think you've won?" Rebecca held his gaze calmly. "Yes, Davis, it's over. We've rescued your captives, seized the evidence. Your supply lines are shut down." He glared at the FBI agents, who were waiting for a sign to move in. "You have no idea. This was bigger than me. There are others, more powerful people." She took a careful step forward. "Then give them up. Save yourself a life sentence." He let out a bitter laugh. "You don't understand how deep this goes. If I talk, I'm a dead man." She leveled her voice, letting an edge of compassion through. "You're already a dead man if you keep resisting. The only difference is whether you face a bullet or a judge." For a moment it looked like he might lower his weapon, but the madness in his eyes flared again. "I built this network for them. We had power, respect, and you come here with your do-gooder attitude, ruin everything. You had to stand up for your father's nonsense." Rebecca felt her anger rise. "You nearly killed him. You destroyed this town for your own greed." Davis aimed his pistol at her. The FBI agents tensed, weapons raised. "So be it," he snarled. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." Time slowed. She saw the intent in his eyes before his finger tightened on the trigger. She dove to the side as the shot rang out, the bullet zipping past her ear. The FBI agents unloaded in response, a staccato of gunfire that ended in seconds. Davis collapsed, multiple rounds in his torso, eyes wide with shock. Deputy Harlan and the others dropped their weapons immediately, hands raised in surrender. The echo of gunfire faded. Rebecca slowly stood, chest heaving. She looked at Davis's still form, pity mixing with relief. It was a harsh end for a man who had terrorized so many, but she couldn't bring herself to feel sorry for him beyond the tragedy of his choices. The feds swept in, cuffing the remaining deputies. Ambulances arrived once more, hauling Davis's body away under a white sheet. By noon, the station was under federal control, and the final stronghold of corruption had fallen. 2 days later, Fellsburg was a whirlwind of arrests, confessions, and revelations. Linda Cook published a bombshell exposé, complete with video stills of the illegal arms crates and testimonies from the rescued hostages. National news outlets picked up the story, shining a spotlight on the small town with big secrets. Henry Carter was released from the hospital the next week, charges against him dropped, and his record expunged. Rebecca stood by his side as he hobbled out, leaning on a cane. The entire town seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as the shadow over Fellsburg finally lifted. She guided him into her sedan, tears in her eyes. "Dad, we got them. It's over." He patted her hand. "I knew you'd do the right thing, baby girl. Always knew." That night, a local church group organized a vigil for the freed captives and those who had lost their lives to the sheriff's reign. Rebecca attended in plain clothes, her father by her side. Linda Cook stood at the pulpit, expressing gratitude to the brave men and women who risked everything. Malik, battered and bandaged from a graze during the final confrontation, stood near the back, nodding respectfully. They exchanged a small smile, an unspoken bond of warriors who had faced fire together. In the following days, federal investigators uncovered more connections to Argent Asset Management, leading to arrests in other states. The conspiracy, once so sure of its invincibility, was collapsing under the combined weight of brave citizens, investigative journalism, and a few well-placed calls to friends in high places. For Henry Carter, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the scars remained. For Rebecca, there was a certain restlessness in the aftermath. She had done her duty, but part of her itched to keep going, to root out every tendril of corruption. Yet she also felt a tug. Maybe she should stay in Fellsburg a while, help rebuild the town, care for her father. After all, home is where you choose to fight for, as one of her old sergeants used to say. Standing on her father's porch, watching the sun set over the quiet streets, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. Fellsburg wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and with evil exposed, the seeds of healing could finally take root. The next morning, Linda Cook came by the Carter house, brandishing the latest edition of the Fellsburg Beacon. The headline read, "Cracks in a Criminal Empire, How One Town Fought Back." Below it was a picture of Rebecca supporting her father, and a smaller inset of the old mill's interior, with seized weapons. She smiled ruefully. "I guess I'm famous now," Rebecca muttered. "You're a hero to a lot of people," Linda said sincerely, "and that means something." "One step at a time, the world changes." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "A quote?" Linda nodded. "An old proverb I heard from my grandma. I think people our age appreciate the wisdom." They shared a laugh. The moment felt warm, connected. Something Fellsburg had desperately needed. Not long afterward, an FBI liaison came to speak with Rebecca privately. He offered a quiet thanks on behalf of those who'd been saved, and asked if she had any interest in consulting for future cases. She was non-committal, though part of her bristled at the idea of becoming an official again. Too many rules, too much red tape. She'd preferred to remain the free agent who could do the right thing without waiting for permission. Meanwhile, the rescued captives began the long journey of recovery, many reuniting with families or seeking professional counseling. A few had no home to return to, so local volunteers stepped up, offering food, shelter, and clothing. It reminded Rebecca that while corruption may flourish in the dark, human kindness can outshine it when given a chance. Malik eventually said his farewells, heading back to his life. Rebecca shook his hand firmly, both of them exchanging a look of mutual respect. "You ever need me, Carter," he said, "just give a holler." "You know it," she replied. "And thank you." He grinned. "Stay safe, soldier." Then he was gone, leaving her with a memory of their time under fire, united by purpose. In the weeks that followed, Linda's ongoing reports exposed more layers of the conspiracy. Local elections were forced, new officials stepped in promising transparency. Henry Carter slowly regained strength, and the community rallied around him. People fixed up the Carter house, repainted the porch, and dropped off home-cooked meals daily, a testament to the goodness that had lain dormant beneath fear. Rebecca sometimes felt restless. She'd walked away from service in the army, but the adrenaline of battle still sang in her veins. Yet she found a new mission here, rebuilding trust, helping the battered town heal. It wasn't flashy, but it mattered just as much as taking down armed terrorists overseas. Late one afternoon, she was approached by a group of teenagers at the local park. They recognized her from the news. "You're that soldier who saved all those people, right?" one boy asked shyly. She nodded, smiling gently. "Something like that. But I had help." Still, another chimed in, it's awesome. You make me think maybe we can stand up for ourselves, you know? She felt a warm glow of pride. You can, and never let anyone tell you otherwise. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on foreign soil but in our own backyards, against those who wear badges yet betray their oath, or those who hide behind suits and shell companies. And sometimes, the heroes aren't the ones with the highest rank, but the ones who refuse to let injustice stand, even if it costs them everything. In the end, Fellsburg found a fragile kind of hope. There would be trials, convictions, a long legal process to hold the guilty accountable. But the voices of the oppressed had found light, and once exposed, corruption rarely thrives. Rebecca Carter's presence had set off a chain reaction. She wasn't just an avenging soldier or a vigilante. She was a catalyst for people rediscovering their own strength. As she sat on her father's freshly painted porch one evening, Henry dozing quietly inside, she gazed at the horizon. A faint breeze carried the scent of magnolias. Tomorrow she'd visit the library's community hall, where Linda was hosting a town forum to discuss next steps. It would be messy, emotional, and likely full of angry outbursts. But that was democracy. That was accountability. Courage is not the absence of fear, her old drill sergeant used to say. It's standing up even when you're afraid. She closed her eyes, letting that truth settle into her bones. Her father was safe. The town was waking up. And she'd discovered a part of herself that still believed in the power of doing right. No matter how twisted the roots of corruption, a single flame of justice could ignite change. Time passed, and the day came when she received a letter from the Department of Defense, acknowledging her service and offering an official commendation for extraordinary heroism in the face of domestic threats. She almost laughed at the formality. Did they think a piece of paper made a difference? She appreciated the sentiment, but medals and commendations had never been her goal. She tucked it away in a drawer, a small memento of a system that sometimes recognized quiet heroes. Henry Carter continued to recover, buoyed by the knowledge that his daughter's efforts had kept their family home safe. The protection fees were no more, and the new sheriff's department leadership was under federal supervision. The transformation wouldn't be instantaneous, but it was a start. Before she'd left the army, Rebecca had learned an Ethiopian proverb that stuck with her. When spiders unite, they can tie down a lion. The corrupt system in Fellsburg had seemed invincible, but once people united, locals, a journalist, a few ex-soldiers, and a father who refused to sign away his rights, they proved that even the biggest lion could be ensnared. Under a crisp autumn sky, the town held a modest ceremony in the park for the survivors of the mill. A few speeches were made, not grandiose but heartfelt. Rebecca stood at the back, arms folded, content to watch from a distance. Linda motioned her forward, wanting her to speak, but she shook her head. This was about the people who'd endured unspeakable trauma. She'd done her part. One of the rescued women, tearful yet determined, stepped to the microphone and said, "I thought I was forgotten, that no one cared, but someone did. We all did, together. Thank you." She looked directly at Rebecca, and their gazes met. A moment of silent gratitude passed between them. Afterwards, Henry found his daughter leaning against an old oak tree, blinking away tears. "I'm proud of you," he said softly, resting a supportive hand on her shoulder. She forced a smile through the lump in her throat. "I'm proud of us, Dad. And I'm proud of this town, stepping up." He nodded, eyes misty. "Remember, baby girl, tough times don't last. Tough people do." She let out a soft laugh. "That's one of those quotes folks our age love, right?" He chuckled. "Darn right." In the weeks that followed, the FBI indicted multiple figures in the network, including distant puppet masters who never expected their well-oiled system to collapse because of one determined woman coming home. The national conversation briefly centered on small-town corruption, shining a rare spotlight on the places where accountability often fails. It wasn't a sweeping reform across the country, but it sparked discussions in local communities about oversight and citizen empowerment. For Rebecca, life settled into a new rhythm. She took on a part-time role at the local community center, teaching self-defense classes to teenagers and volunteering with the battered women's shelter that had opened after Linda's exposé. She never told most of them about her past feats or her army record. She didn't have to. Her presence alone, calm yet firm, was enough. Sometimes the nightmares came. The flashbacks of infiltration missions gone wrong, or the memory of that terrified woman at the mill. But Henry was there. Linda was there. Even Jody the mechanic dropped by to chat. She realized she had formed a new kind of squad. Not a special forces unit, but friends and neighbors fighting for a better community. Months later, on a bright winter morning, the trial of the main conspirators concluded. Davis's top lieutenants got lengthy prison terms. The judge declared the entire racket one of the most brazen cases of local corruption and human trafficking in recent memory. In a statement read to the press, the judge praised the courage of citizens who stood firm against intimidation. Standing on the courthouse steps after the verdict, Linda Cook turned to Rebecca. "Any comment for the papers?" Rebecca shook her head, adjusting the collar of her coat against the chill. "I'm just glad justice was served." Linda typed that down anyway, then closed her notepad. "We did it." Rebecca nodded. "We sure did." That night, as she settled back on the porch with a mug of cocoa, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. In a matter of weeks, her entire world had shifted. She'd seen the darkest sides of human greed right here at home, not just overseas, and she'd witnessed the brightest resilience of ordinary people refusing to be crushed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Malik. "Heard the verdict. Congrats, soldier. Proud of you." She smiled, typed back a thanks. She glanced at the stars overhead, remembering an old quote from her army days. "One man with courage is a majority." But she knew it took more than one man, or woman. It took a whole community, united by a cause. She sipped her cocoa, letting the steam warm her face. Henry Carter appeared behind her, leaning on the doorframe. "Mind if I join you?" She scooted over, making room on the porch swing. He sat, exhaling contentedly. They rocked gently in silence, father and daughter, both bearing scars of different battles. Finally, Henry spoke, voice trembling slightly. "I just want you to know. You gave me hope, Becca, when I thought everything was lost." She set her hand on his. "You gave me something worth fighting for." He closed his eyes, nodded. "Sometimes, you gotta stand up and fight your own people so you can save them. Hardest thing in the world." She swallowed the lump in her throat. Hard, but necessary. In the distance, the lights of Fellsburg glowed faintly. She knew the town faced a long road ahead, economically and socially. Trauma didn't vanish overnight, and the vacant stores wouldn't fill themselves instantly. But at least the fear had lifted. People dared to raise their voices again, and that was the first step toward genuine change. In the end, life in Fellsburg would never be the same. It had lost its innocence, but it gained something more powerful, the will to confront its demons. A quiet revolution had taken place, not led by any single hero, but by neighbors who refused to yield. Rebecca Carter, the black woman from a humble background who'd served in the Army's shadowy missions, had come home to find an enemy wearing badges and business suits. She'd learned that the war for justice isn't limited to foreign lands. It can rage right in your own backyard. But she also discovered that a community bound by truth and compassion could stand against the darkest of threats. Because real courage, as those middle-aged or older might say, isn't about shining in the spotlight. It's about carrying on in the face of overwhelming odds, guided by the values you refuse to surrender. Lessons learned for those who read and reflect. True power rests in unity. A single voice may be silenced, but a chorus of voices demanding truth cannot be easily ignored. When people band together, even the mightiest oppression can crumble. Corruption thrives in darkness, but light is free. Evil festers when good people stay silent. Shedding light on wrongdoing through evidence, journalism, or collective action forces it to wither. Home is worth fighting for. We often look at distant threats, forgetting that danger can lurk closest to our hearts. Sometimes, the greatest battles are fought to protect the people and places we love. Courage is a choice, not an absence of fear. Both civilians and soldiers showed bravery in the face of terror. They were afraid, But they acted anyway, proving that ordinary individuals can become extraordinary under pressure. Forging a future from the ashes, rebuilding trust after betrayal, is a long process. Healing requires honesty, accountability, and community support. Yet it's possible, one day at a time. Remember, as Henry Carter might say, there's no storm that lasts forever. In Fellsburg, the storm of corruption finally broke, leaving a clearer sky for those determined to make tomorrow brighter than yesterday. And so it goes. In every small town, in every heart that dares to believe that justice isn't just a dream, but something we create together.